But there's another world event taking place that I think is worthy of attention. And that is, of course, the situation in Rojava. So, for those who are not aware, Rojava, or the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, had emerged as a political project during the Syrian Civil War around 2012 as a Kurdish-led but poly-ethnic movement rooted in democratic and federalism, which is a political philosophy that was developed by Abdullah Öcalan, who was a guy who was influenced by both Marxism and the work of Murray Bookchin, who's an American communalist who was, a socialist, but also had taken some inspiration from anarchism before his break from anarchism. And so there was a lot of sympathies from all these different ideological camps towards the movement in Rojava, towards the project, towards this democratic and federalist society that was aiming to create like a different type of government. A form of government that was a bit more participatory than the typical governments, and that was a bit more involved in progressing the population socially, politically, economically, everything. So they arise in a time when ISIS was making a lot of moves in the region, and Bashar al-Assad had to pull away troops from North Syria in order to support forces in another part of the country. So when those troops were withdrawn, the Kurds in North Syria recognized their vulnerability to ISIS, and so they had organized this force to kind of respond to that threat. And so the project was a matter of both military survival and also ideological experimentation, because the project of defense against ISIS ended up being led by a party that had a political project, and that was an offshoot of the PKK, which is a party for Kurdish liberation in Turkey that had a spin-off of the PKK, sparked off this project in North Syria. And they had, local assemblies, they had a secular approach to governance, they had a lot of efforts to implement gender equality, and a few, experiments in cooperative economics. Their goal was not to seize state power or to establish a nation state. They were trying to, develop something different. I think its ideology is actually quite often misunderstood. And I think the ideology that you see on paper in the words of Abdullah Öcalan was not always implemented in effect, in actuality. And obviously not everything about the operation of Rojava was transparent to the public, particularly the English-speaking public, because obviously they can't do everything with that kind of outward orientation. I don't want to say annoyed, but I am thrown for a loop when people act like Rojava is or was an anarchist project. And you see that Fall of Rojava, which we're going to get into in a moment, it gets like weaponized by people online who are just like, you see, you anarchists feel this kind of sick people who have this kind of mentality of trying to one-up you by treating people on the other side of the world as pawns in their intellectual game. I say that to say, Rojava not being anarchist doesn't mean that I don't stand solidarity with the people in Rojava, right? I don't think that Rojava had to be anarchist to be worthy of consideration or analysis or, even at times admiration. As I've matured in my anarchism, I think I do make more of an effort to clarify political distinctions, but I think that attempt to clarify often gets confused with team sports or some kind of dismissal. I'm fine admitting that Rojava is not anarchist, and while I may wish for more anarchist projects in the world, I can also observe what other projects are doing and see what lessons could be drawn from them. I will say also that you don't have to become a cheerleader for these kinds of projects. I think you should have solidarity with people. I think you should be guided by certain values. I think your analysis should account for the conditions that people are in, but I do think you'd also need to draw certain lines. Where you decide to draw that line is up to you, but I do think there needs to be certain lines. And so I say that to say that not everything in Rojava was sunshine and rainbows. They had to face accountability for using child soldiers. At one point, for example, there were some allegations of war crimes that were unconfirmed, and some of them were spurious, I would say, due to the source where those allegations were coming from, that being Turkey, which was an enemy to Rojava and as an enemy to Kurdish autonomy and Kurdish freedom anywhere in the world, to be honest, because they deny the existence of Kurdish people as a distinct ethnic group. They called them Mountain Turks for the longest while, right? And so, looping back around a bit, so Rojava had the YPG and the YPJ, which were the defense groups, and one of them was a women's army, famously, that was part of the SDF, which was a Syrian Defense Forces, like a coalition of groups, mainly Kurdish groups, but other groups as well, they were key to defeating ISIS in that region. And so they got tactical backing from the US and others in that, time where they were fighting ISIS and also fighting Turkey and also dealing with rivalry from other Kurdish factions. Like I believe there was a Kurdish party in Iraq that was not really a fan of Rojava because Rojava had ended up marginalizing the Kurdish party in Syria that Iraqi party was aligned with. Messy situation, as is to be expected from these kinds of times and places and moments in history. And so Rojava, over the years of its existence, had to deal with a lot of shifting alliances of convenience. There were times when they cooperated with Assad's government, times when they did not. They had some limited cooperation with the US. They even had some limited cooperation with Russia, less so than the US. The US was at times seen as vital ally for Rojava, sometimes I think overstated, but it is undeniable that the US did play a significant role in aiding them in their fight against ISIS, particularly while they were being economically blockaded and militarily encircled by all of these hostile forces. Again, I want to say that it's very unfortunate, I think, that the story of Rojava has been hijacked by all these different narratives, and things like coincidences of interest or alliances of convenience get blown up to the point where I see people claiming that Rojava was just a puppet, right? That Rojava just existed for the US, right? And I mean, it's very easy to sit back and say, well, they shouldn't have aligned themselves with US at all, right? Despite the fact that they were in an unfriendly region facing Syrian opposition, jihadists, fellow Kurds, even Turkey. It's not to say that I don't think that being in that hostile region, and this is me opining, of course, not that I have any kind of material effect on what happens, but I think they could have prepared themselves better for the inevitable betrayal of the US. But what do I know? For all I know, there could have been more preparations taking place, and those preparations still weren't enough to deal with what happened next. I think another L that the project took was one of the SDF commanders, a guy named Mazloum Abdi, made a statement saying he'd welcome support from anyone at this point in time. This is when the new Syrian government came into the picture and was clearly moving against Rojava, against the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, and trying to wipe it out, basically. And so at that point in time of desperation, he said he'd accept support from anyone. He said anyone, even Israel, which is absurd to me. Because, Israel is not in any position to help anybody, and I'm sure that statement would have faced denouncement and disagreement from within Rojava because, one military commander does not represent an entire population. But I think that's a really irresponsible statement to be made, especially when all eyes are on the situation. And at this point in time, the world has turned against Israel. Rightfully so. I think it was very unwise. Even if you can squint your eyes and say, okay, well, anybody means anybody could help us at this point. It's still, I think, a careless thing to say or an unwise thing to say in this global context. And I disagree with that approach. I can think what I want. It doesn't really have an effect on the outcome, which we're going to talk about next, right? Because he made that statement, but it didn't change what happened next. So the US withdrew from Syria in 2019 under Trump, and that enabled the Turkish government to invade and take over a lot of the territory in Rojava. It ended up splitting the territorial continuity and also ended up creating a situation where they were once again vulnerable to the regional power struggles taking place. And so, well, as many of you will know, Bashar al-Assad's government collapsed in late 2024, and the Al-Qaeda derived Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or the HTS, ended up seizing state power, led by Ahmed al-Shara, who is now rebranded internationally and received a lot of regional and Western acceptance, despite his continued repression of minorities in Syria. The Alawites, the Druze, these are massacres taking place in these populations, tragic situations, and they're worthy of at least remembrance, even if there may not be much we can do materially. At least attention can be drawn to the situation. So the HTS and jihadists and Turkish-backed forces have been moving against the Kurdish regions, besieging cities and targeting civilian infrastructure and displacing hundreds of thousands of people. And they also ended up, because of their invasive activity, they led to the freedom of ISIS prisoners from their detention sites in the region. And so a lot of them have been let loose in the country, basically. And so under the pressure they were facing from the new Syrian government, the SDF conceded most of the territory of Rojava and ended up retaining only the Hasaka region and the city of Kobane before they eventually agreed to a ceasefire and state reintegration. And this has essentially marked the fall of Rojava, right? You can see from this article, they came to an agreement. And by late January, about 80% of Rojava's territory had already been lost to the Syrian government. And now its military and civilian institutions are going to be absorbed into the Syrian state. The police in Rojava are going to be absorbed into the Interior Ministry. The military are going to be absorbed into the state military. Although the fate of the Women's Protection Unit is still not clear. The YPJ's fate has not yet been stated as far as I'm aware. And while the elements of civilian administration are now being folded into the state. I don't have any contacts on the ground in Rojava personally, but I know someone who knows somebody. And the word that I got on the ground was that, people are not happy with the situation at all. And I intend to talk more about it on my next It Could Happen Here podcast episode, because I'll be talking to the guy, James Stout, who has that kind of contact. He's actually been to Rojava himself. So if you want to get more insight on the situation, you can probably tune into that episode when we eventually record it and release it. But this is the current fate of Rojava, right? They got certain limited cultural and legal recognitions. Kurdish recognized as a national language, the celebration of Nowruz, which is a Kurdish holiday, being recognized in Syria, the restoration of citizenship for people who had their citizenship stripped by the Syrian government. And right now this agreement looks like it'll hold up, at least from what I can see. It was endorsed by the US and by France and by a couple other regional actors, and it's a tragedy, I would say. I would say that it's a tragedy. I think I have not yet settled on the lessons that we can glean from this beyond a recognition that simply establishing a site of relative autonomy is never going to be enough. And the recognition that had there been greater solidarity within the region, we wouldn't be in the position that we are in now with Rojava. If there were, sibling movements in the neighboring territories, they may have had more resilience, more solidarity that would have provided an element of protection, safety, defense. To the Kurds and the Assyrians and the Armenians and the Arabs and all the rest who were part of the Rojava project, I wish you all the best. My heart is with you all, and I hope that whatever comes next does not smother the spark of revolution and revolutionary imagination. That this is not the end, but merely an interruption in the fight. Blessings.